Hello. In this video, we're going to go through the construction of a basic class. To start with, we have two files here on the left-hand side. We have one file called fraction.java, and we have a second file called fraction runner. The first thing I'd like you to take note of is that the fraction class has no main method. What that means is that we can't actually execute the fraction class. If we look at fraction runner, we'll see that there is a main method. A convention that I've adopted is that whenever I want to write a file to test a specific class, I'll call it something runner. So I will use this class to test the fraction class, so I call it fraction runner. Okay, so the first thing we want to make sure we know before starting into this is we want to be able to define what a class is. And a class is a blueprint to create objects. So we design a class so that we can use that same class over and over again to create numerous instances of that class. So we create a number of objects. When we actually develop this blueprint, there are two questions we have to ask ourselves. What are the attributes and what are the behaviors? Let's start with what are the attributes. So if you were to describe a fraction to someone, you have to ask yourself, what would you need to tell them about that fraction? And really simply, in order to understand a fraction, we need to know two things. We need to know the numerator and the denominator. So the attributes for a class are what are called fields. And fields are defined directly below the class header. So in our case, we're going to have two fields. We're going to have an integer numerator, and we're going to have an integer for the denominator. Now notice I haven't given these any values yet. The reason is that until I create this object, I don't know what I want the numerator and denominator to be. So I don't actually assign the values. Now that being said, I could here put equals 9, equals 7, but this field or instance variable is most likely going to change. So that's the first question. What are the attributes? The second question is, what are the behaviors? So it might seem kind of funny in this case to think about behaviors of fractions, but maybe if we rephrase this to say, what are the things you can do with fractions? So we might add fractions, we might multiply fractions, we might multiply a fraction by a constant. These are the different types of actions we want our fraction to be able to take, or behaviors. Behaviors are methods, and there's a couple different types of methods we need to consider. Specifically, we have instance methods and class methods. In this video, we're going to start just by looking at instance methods. So that's while we're up here. What are the attributes? Attributes are fields. So for example, we might say one behavior could be we might want to multiply our fraction by a constant value. So a behavior in a class would be a method. So we would start with public, and here's the difference from everything else we've done to this point. In the past, we'd always say public static. When you write an instance method, you do not include the word static. So this method, we go public, then we have the return type. There's going to be no return type in this case. And we're going to call this method multiply fraction. And then it's going to take one parameter called a, which is going to be the value that we multiply this fraction by. So if I was to multiply a fraction by some value a, what I would have to do then is I would have to take the numerator and multiply it by a. So even though there's no object yet, we have to kind of imagine what would happen in this case to the fields associated with this object. So if I was to multiply a fraction by a, I would take the numerator and I would make the numerator equal to the numerator times a. So a class consists of a class header, fields, or what we think of as attributes, methods, what we think of as behaviors. Now you'll notice something in the middle here called a constructor. A constructor is a special type of method. And there are a number of kind of bullet ideas you'll want to memorize about constructors, and we'll get into those in some later videos. But for now, what we want to know about a constructor is that the constructor is a special type of method that always has to be declared below the fields. It has to be the first method that is declared. And secondly, a constructor has no return type. So in this case, we'd say public, and a constructor is always named the same as the class. So in this case, our class is called fraction, so that we'd say public fraction, and this is my constructor here. So if we scroll down here, we see we now have a very basic class set up here. There's the end of the class. So we have our class header, our fields, which are our attributes, a constructor, which is a special type of method that is called when you first create an instance of this object, of this class, and then we have our method, or our methods, which define behaviors. So let's test this now. So I'm going to go over here to fraction runner, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an instance of the fraction. So I'm going to say fraction f1 equals, and whenever we make a new instance of a class, we have to say new fraction. So now what I have is I have this fraction called f1. And fraction f1 consists of a numerator and denominator. So what I could do here is I could say system.out.println f1.num, and then I'm going to put f1.denominator. So if I run this now, I should get 0 over 0. And that's what we see right there. But let's say we want to set these values. To set the values, we can access them by saying I'm going to take object f1, and I'm going to take f1 num, and I'm going to set it equal to 1. And I'm going to take f1 dot denominator, and I'm going to set it to 2. So now if we take this line here and copy it, we see that if we run this, down here we see the fraction becomes 1/2. So now let's imagine I want to take this fraction and multiply it. I want to use that method here that we have called multiply fraction. So to access that method, I'm going to use the dot notation. So I'm going to take f1 because that's the fraction I want to act on, and I'm going to put dot. And you'll notice all these methods in here. Some of these methods are inherited from superclasses, but right there's the one that we want, multiply fraction, and we're going to multiply it by, say, 6. And then what we'll do is we'll print out that fraction again. So just the thinking here, we create a fraction called f1, and since the constructor doesn't actually define it with any values, f1 numerator is 0 and f1 denominator is 0. So when we print it out, we get 0, 0. But then I change f1 numerator to 1, and I change f1 denominator to 2. And so when I print it out, I get 1 over 2. But then I actually use the behavior, which is a method called multiply fraction, and I pass it the value of 6. So it's going to be 1 over 2 times 6, which is going to leave me with 6 over 2. Let's run that and see if we're right. And there we go. So now we're going to do one last thing here before we wrap up. Notice here that I created my instance of a fraction, and then I actually had to go and manually set f1 numerator and f1 denominator. Well, it turns out you can actually write your constructor such that it takes parameters. So I'm going to rewrite my constructor here so that it takes an integer, and I'm going to call that a, and it's going to take another integer called b. And I'm going to set the numerator equal to a and the denominator equal to b. So now if I go to fraction runner, I'm going to remove these 3 lines here, and you'll notice you have an error now, see? And that error is essentially saying your constructor now has parameters, you have to pass it. So I'm going to give it the values 1 and 2. So now, what I've done is I've rewritten my constructor such that I'm passing some information.